The Civil War was barely 18 months old when the Connecticut Regiment joined the Union Army encamped in Northern Virginia. One of those New England soldiers looked around him and wrote, "This is one of the most wretched, God-forsaken places I ever saw. Nearly every building has been burned, and not a living soul to be seen except soldiers. The country around has been stripped of everything by both armies, and a man would almost as soon starve as he would in the center of the Arabian desert." Virginia, the mother state of America, was one of the last states to leave the Union in 1861. It did so with a sad heart, but with a determination to defend the liberties and the properties it felt were guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. Secession led to war, and proud Virginia all too quickly became the major battleground for the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history. The Union Navy seized control of Virginia rivers below the fall lines at Fredericksburg, Richmond, and Petersburg. The Blue Ridge Mountains, with the thick layers of the Alleghanies beyond, blocked large-scale military movements in extreme western Virginia. Hence, the Old Dominion's major theater of war became a 70-mile-wide corridor known as the North Central Piedmont. This upper half of Virginia's rolling hill country extended from the Potomac River to Charlottesville. It was a wealthy land of horses, orchards, tobacco, and grain fields. Slaveholders and small farmers lived side by side. So did blacks and whites. The coming of Civil War touched each deeply and differently. Loyalties became divided. Patriotism took not one but three forms. You were for the Union, against the Union, or opposed to the war itself. In that fractured society and across the quiet and gently rolling hills of the Virginia Piedmont, Union and Confederate armies moved and fought relentlessly for 4 years. No one could escape the onslaughts. Everyone suffered some effect from them. What follows is a sampling of the war in a beautiful region that tragically became known as the Desolate Land. The Potomac River was the natural dividing line between the Union and the Confederacy for the first months of the Civil War. General George B. McClellan's Union Army patrolled the northern bank. General Joseph E. Johnston's Confederate soldiers patrolled the southern bank, and each side warily watched the other to see what might develop. In mid-October 1861, General McClellan learned that a southern buildup of some sort was taking place in Leesburg, a small town only 35 miles upriver from Washington. McClellan decided to send an armed reconnaissance across the river to see what was in fact developing. On October 21st, 1861, Colonel Edward Baker led a small brigade of 1,700 Union infantry across the river. They proceeded across flat ground and then began to scale the steep and muddy slopes of a height known as Balls Bluff. They were out in the open until they reached the top. Then they entered a dense clump of woods and walked right into a hornet's nest. Confederate soldiers had prepared hasty earthworks, including felled trees. The Union Brigade marched right into the face of that defense. Confederates fired point-blank musketry. Scores of Federals were killed. Hundreds were captured. The remainder fled pell-mell back down the hill. Many tried to cross the Potomac by swimming. Others piled into boats that capsized from the overloads. Just how many men drowned, we don't know, but the casualties at Balls Bluff were horrible. 300 Federals killed or wounded, 600 Federals missing or captured. It was a disaster of first magnitude, especially since the Confederate losses were barely 150 men. Among the killed at Balls Bluff was Colonel Edward Baker. Among the seriously wounded Lieutenant Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., who later became a distinguished Supreme Court justice. Among the captured, Captain Paul Revere, a descendant and namesake of the famous Revolutionary War hero. This is the smallest national cemetery in America. It is the cemetery at Balls Bluff. Significantly, this battle was, comparatively speaking, insignificant, but it had tremendous ramifications. For one thing, the Union general in charge, Charles P. Stone, was accused of treason and driven from the Army. General-in-Chief Winfield Scott was forced into early retirement. And the Congress, angry at what had happened here, created the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, a congressional committee that did a lot of snooping and found few solutions. For days thereafter, citizens of Washington, D.C. saw out in the Potomac, floating by the Capitol, the dead and bloated bodies of scores of Union soldiers. They were a constant reminder, if not an unforgettable one, of what had happened upriver at a place called Balls Bluff. Situated between the towns of Culpepper and Orange is an imposing height known as Clark's Mountain. It dominates the countryside and gives unobstructed views to both north and east. From there, troop movements from the far side of the Rapidan River, 5 miles away, were easily visible on a clear day. It was from there in August 1862 that Confederate Generals Lee and Jackson watched General John Pope's Federal Army retire northward. The strategy for a second campaign at Manassas consequently took shape. From Clark's Mountain in May 1864, Lee saw that the great sea of tents that had been the Union Army in camp had suddenly disappeared. Blue columns were streaming southward toward the Rapidan River. Lee declared, "My whole trust is in God, and I am ready for whatever He may ordain." In that spirit, the Southern commander came down from the mountain to begin the final climactic campaign of the war. While Lee was containing General George McClellan's 1862 thrust on Richmond, a second Union army invaded the Northern Piedmont. It was under the command of General John Pope. Lee detached Stonewall Jackson's divisions from the main Confederate Army and sent them to Gordonsville to watch and, if possible, to stop Pope. Jackson learned that the Union forces in his front were badly extended. On August 9, 1862, Jackson attacked the advance elements south of Culpepper. The arena was the valley of Cedar Run, in the shadow of a steep-sided ridge known variously as Cedar Mountain and Slaughter Mountain. Fighting got underway around noon with the temperature hovering at 100 degrees, making it the hottest day on which any major combat occurred in Virginia during the war. It was not one of Jackson's best conducted battles, but through determination and inspiration on his part, Jackson was able to beat back Union attacks and inflict almost twice the casualties that he suffered. Jackson supposedly considered Cedar Mountain the most successful of his exploits. If that be so, and in view of the 1,400 men he lost there, Jackson must have been thinking only of his personal participation in the action. This is Loudoun County in northern Virginia. It would suffer more damage during the Civil War than any other Virginia county in which no major action took place. Other than the minor engagement at Balls Bluff, the action here was mostly skirmishes, but these skirmishes were severe, because this was a border county in which sentiments on both sides were strong. Here it was a war of neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend, family member against family member. Within a year after the war began, 2 companies had formed in the county. One, White's Rebels, was a Confederate unit led by Captain Elijah White. The other, the Loudoun Rangers, was a Unionist force under Captain Samuel Means. Each of these bands conducted numerous raids throughout Loudoun County. It was inevitable that sooner or later they were going to meet, and this they did in late August 1862, when White learned that Means' company was camped in the Waterford Baptist Church. White's men quietly approached Waterford. His plan was to divide his force. Half of them would come galloping down the main road, making a lot of noise so as to attract the attention of the Loudoun Rangers inside the church. The other half would hide in what was then a cornfield immediately across the road. The plan worked perfectly. With all the noises of the horses rushing down the roads, the Loudon Rangers came rushing out of the door only to run into a direct gunfire from Confederates across the road. The Federals quickly retreated into the church where a standoff fight began. For 3 hours that morning, trapped inside the Waterford Baptist Church, the little band of Loudon Rangers shot it out with White's rebels having surrounded them on the outside. Finally, with ammunition running low and having been given promises beforehand of a parole if they would surrender, the 24 members of the Loudon Rangers laid down their arms. Casualties in the engagement were small by Civil War standards, 2 men killed, 9 wounded on each side. After the surrender, a member of White's rebels tried to kill a member of the Loudon Rangers, but was stopped from doing so. What had caused him to do this? He had recognized his brother fighting on the other side. The Civil War is often called a brother's war. Here in Waterford in August 1862, inside this church, the war surely became that. The following comment on Civil War partisan rangers and guerrillas comes from a warm friend of mine, William C. Davis, one of the most esteemed Civil War historians in the country and a descendant of a guerrilla in Missouri.
Whether one called them partisan rangers, bushwhackers, or irregulars, they waged the kind of guerrilla warfare that was on occasion uncivilized. In the Civil War, these bands displayed unusual variation in their behavior. Guerrilla actions in the Western and Trans-Mississippi departments were notorious for killing, looting, and burning. In Kansas and Missouri, pro-Union Jayhawkers under Charles Jennison showed no restraint in their atrocities. In their ranks were horse thieves, murderers, and fugitives from the law. Their Confederate counterparts were equally ruthless fighters led by William Clark Quantrill, a former Ohio schoolteacher. Quantrill's band contained such future Western bad men as Frank and Jesse James, Bloody Bill Anderson, and the Younger Brothers. In Virginia, the guerrilla war was tamer. The greatest practitioner was John Singleton Mosby. Unlike guerrillas in the West, Mosby's men wore regulation uniforms, usually paroled their captives, and more often than not conducted themselves according to the rules of war. Mosby's kind of warfare behind enemy lines attracted a wide variety of men. Some were discharged veterans, men on furlough, soldiers disenchanted with the infantry life. Others were deserters and freebooters in search of plunder, as well as young farm boys lured by the aura of excitement. Mosby's iron discipline was the one thing that kept them in check. His actions were tame by comparison to other such bands. Still, the hatred engendered by these guerrilla detachments survived long after the war ceased. Thousands of unarmed civilians who had never heard a cannon had felt the bloody hand of roaming groups of bushwhackers. Post-war newspapers describing train robberies, shootouts, and the like made it a point to identify the culprits as former Civil War guerrillas. On the other hand, partisan rangers drained manpower from enemy armies by forcing them to establish guard posts here and there behind the lines. Confederate guerrillas did more damage to the Union war efforts than an equal number of frontline soldiers. In doing so, however, they helped make the Civil War a total war, involving civilians as well as soldiers. The exploits of the legendary Mosby in such an atmosphere almost remind one of Robin Hood and his merry men in Sherwood Forest.
These boulders were the first attempt to mark the site of the Battle of Chantilly, which is not well known, but it should be. Here on September 1, 1862, General Jackson attempted once again to flank Pope's army, which was retreating from 2nd Manassas. Here in the afternoon, a battle broke out. Jackson caught up with the rear of the Union Army. He stopped, decided to wait, but the Union armies across the way decided instead to attack. And the first attack came here, at Ox Hill, as it's sometimes called, Chantilly, as it's best remembered. General Isaac Stevens, a feisty little commander, barely 5 feet tall, led the first attack with his division against Jackson's line. In very rapid fashion, 5 color bearers went down. Stevens dismounted from his horse, grabbed the flag, hollered, "Follow me, boys, follow your general," and he led them forward. and himself was killed. The second attack came from the other Union division under New Jersey's most distinguished soldier, General Philip Kearny, who had lost an arm in the Mexican War. As Kearny's men started forward, a torrential rainstorm began. Driving rain, accelerated by gusty winds, made visibility practically zero. Kearny's men fared no better. Indeed, Kearny himself, in all the confusion and lack of visibility, rode into the Confederate lines and was himself killed. After about 2 hours, the two sides broke off, thanks in large part to weather, and the Battle of Chantilly ended. The Battle of Chantilly cost 1,500 casualties, including two of the Union's finer generals, Stevens and Kearny. Today, very little is remembered about the battlefield, namely because there is no battlefield, thanks to the greed of developers and the short-sightedness of county governments. It is often said that those who forget history are condemned to relive it. The Battle of Chantilly deserves a better fate than this small plot of ground. Warrenton is centrally located in the Northern Piedmont. It is the seat of Fauquier County. It was a supply depot and important stop on the vital Orange and Alexandria Railroad. Union forces therefore occupied the town for most of the war. Confederates understandably staged a number of raids on Warrenton and the adjacent area, and the man most in the forefront of those raids was the most famous partisan ranger of the Civil War, Colonel John Singleton Mosby. They called him the Gray Ghost of the Confederacy, but he was more than a wispy figure in the night. Union General-in-Chief Ulysses Grant declared in his memoirs, "There were probably but few men in the South who could have commanded successfully a separate detachment in the rear of an opposing army and so near the border of hostilities as long as John S. Mosby did." Mosby was born near Richmond in 1833. Expelled from the University of Virginia and jailed for shooting a fellow student, Mosby studied law in prison, received a pardon from the governor, and became a practicing attorney in southwest Virginia's Washington County. In 1861, he enlisted as a private in the 1st Virginia Cavalry Regiment. He served for a time as a scout for General Jeb Stuart. In January 1863, Mosby was authorized to begin guerrilla activities in northern Virginia. His command was officially known as the 43rd Virginia Cavalry Battalion. His mission was, quote, to weaken the armies invading Virginia by harassing their rear. Mosby hardly looked the part of a dashing leader of partisan rangers. He stood 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed barely 125 pounds. Yet inside the cold-eyed Virginian were a keen intellect, a restless spirit, and total absence of fear. He recruited his men, drilled them, and planned the raids they were to conduct. The battalion he led never numbered over 800 men. However, Mosby customarily used only 20 to 60 men at a time. Most of them were innocent civilians by day and hell-raising cavalrymen by night. They swooped down on outposts and picket lines. They ambushed railroads, wagon trains, and troop detachments. They burnt culverts and bridges behind the lines. They waylaid any Federal couriers or scouts they encountered. Mosby's most notable feat came in March 1863, when he captured a Union general in his bed, only 10 miles from Washington, D.C. Mosby refused to surrender at the end of the Civil War. He simply disbanded his mounted companies. Most people tended to ignore the last 50 years of Mosby's life. What was remembered then, and is remarkable still, are the antics of this pint-sized colonel whose nighttime attacks were so many and so unnerving that for the last 2 years of the war, the northern counties of Fauquier and Loudoun were known as Mosby's Confederacy. Amazingly enough, after the war, Colonel Mosby came to the town he had raided a number of times, Warrenton, and here he made his home for a number of years. Let's go into the house now and listen to Jim Moyer, who knows as much about Mosby as anyone alive, tell the fascinating story of what happened to the colonel in the post-war years.
At the end of the fighting during the Civil War period in 1865, Colonel Mosby decided to set up a law practice here in Warrenton, Virginia. And at that time, he had a young son and daughter and his wife, whom he brought out to Rhode Island, which is a farm about 2 miles north of Warrenton, out on Route 17. And they rented the farm there. It was a Jeffries home, and stayed there for 2 years. And then he decided he had enough of riding back and forth into town to argue his law cases, and came to this home here on Main Street, and first rented the place and then purchased it. Mosby, as you can well imagine, had a hard time obtaining his parole. He was very much hated by the Northern troops and Northern officials. His wife became very worried that he would never be allowed to live a completely free life. And she felt that since her father had served with President Andrew Johnson in the U.S. Congress, perhaps if she went to him in Washington, D.C., that he could arrange to set up some type of certificate or parole where the Northern officials would completely let him alone and he could lead his own life. Unfortunately, President Johnson turned her down, really acted very coldly toward her. And while she was in Washington, D.C., she decided, well, she would go over and see General U.S. Grant. And when Grant heard her story, he sat down and wrote out the sort of a certificate that Colonel Mosby was not to be bothered thereafter as long as he observed the conditions of his parole. That was the beginning of the friendship between the two men. He campaigned for U.S. Grant, particularly in the campaign of 1872, and many Virginians and Southerners turned against Mosby. They felt that he was a political turncoat, so he and his family were very much ostracized here, and eventually moved his practice into Washington, D.C. One night in 1876, he had come back to visit, and he had gotten off the railroad car down here at the depot, which is now a restaurant, and someone took a shot at him. And when ex-President Grant heard about this, he prevailed on President Rutherford B. Hayes to appoint Mosby as consul to Hong Kong, China. Finally, Mosby did get his consulship to Hong Kong, spent several years there. Later went in to do work for the Department of Interior and the Department of Justice. And with him finally dying over in Washington, D.C. at Garfield Hospital on May 31st, 1916, and being buried out here in the local Warrenton Cemetery.
Warrenton was so centrally located by rail and road that it could not escape the destructive hand of war. Buildings were torched or converted to military use. Devastation of nearby farmland was such that a resident would spend the post-war years grieving over what she called our bare acres. The town had one moment of drama. In November 1862, Lincoln gave up on cautious General George McClellan. The president removed the general from command of the Army of the Potomac. On November 10, McClellan bade the Army farewell at the Warrenton Hotel. There's a pitiful side to the Warrenton story as well. The town was swamped with wounded soldiers after the opening battle of the war at Manassas. The human flood never stopped. Churches, school buildings, private homes, all became hospitals. Women unaccustomed to hardships volunteered as nurses and saw life at its harshest. Throughout 1861 and 1862, Confederates who died at Warrenton were buried in the town cemetery. Each grave had a neat wooden cross with a name etched on the horizontal board. In the bitterly cold winter of 1862 and 63, the Union soldiers occupying Warrenton pulled up the crosses and used them for firewood. The graves were nameless. With the coming of peace in 1865, all the unknown dead were placed in a common grave under a marble monument dedicated simply to Virginia's defenders. In 1861, Culpepper County had been one of the wealthiest sections of the Old Dominion. The leading crop was tobacco, with the average farm being 260 acres. Some 5,000 whites and 7,000 blacks comprised the population. The county seat was the town of Culpepper. It boasted 60 merchants, a dozen physicians, another dozen attorneys. Culpepper was a pleasant place. One soldier called it a trim little village lying in the hollow of several hills. A number of things gave Culpepper unusual strategic importance in the Civil War. It lay about halfway between the two opposing national capitals. It was a major stop on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad and a commercial center on the old Carolina Road, now US 29. Culpepper was also situated between two eastward flowing rivers, the Rappahannock and the Rapidan. Visualize an army on the move, and one naturally thinks of long columns of infantry snaking down a road. That is a misleading view. For an army to advance, all of its elements had to advance as well. The foot soldiers could not move forward any distance unless they were accompanied by supply wagons, cannon, caissons, and the tons of equipment that a large fighting force has to have. This meant that getting across a river was a difficult and hazardous undertaking. Men, animals, wagons, supplies, all must get to the other side or none could go. This is why river fords became so vital in Civil War military history. Those shallow spots enabled an army to conquer river obstacles. At the same time, an army defending a river did not need to post men along every foot of the riverbank. All it had to do was guard the major fords and the bridges. A number of fords in Virginia became first military objectives and then the scene of heavy fighting. One such crossing was Kelly's Ford. It was 6 miles east of Culpepper and offered passage across the Rappahannock River. The northern bank was much higher than the southern bank and thus made for an ideal defensive position. No fewer than 8 engagements took place at Kelly's Ford. One in March 1863 was a running cavalry fight. Among the slain on the Confederate side was Major John Pelham. At the Battle of Fredericksburg 3 months earlier, Lee had praised the young and dashing artillery officer, and he had dubbed him the gallant Pelham. About 5 miles south of Kelly's Ford on the Rappahannock was Germanna Ford on the Rapidan. Germanna Ford was just outside the western boundary of that 72-square-mile foreboding expanse of tangled woods and thick underbrush known as the Wilderness. In April 1863, General Joseph Hooker used Germanna Ford for his offensive against Lee. That campaign ended in Union disaster at Chancellorsville. In November of that year, General George Meade sent the same army splashing across the ford in another campaign. It came to naught at Mine Run. Then in May 1864, with General U.S. Grant at its head, the Union Army crossed Germanna Ford again. This time, there was no turning back. What was known as the Overland Campaign began at Germanna Ford and ended at Appomattox Courthouse. By 1863, some real Union horse commanders had begun to emerge. That was solid and silent John Buford. Judson Kilpatrick, a lanky little man with all the attributes of a loose cannon, and a flamboyant hell-for-leather horseman called George Armstrong Custer. On June 8, 1863, Jeb Stuart had held a grand review at Brandy Station just north of Culpepper. Early the next morning, the Union cavalry struck. In an 11-hour fight here on the open grounds and knolls around Brandy Station, it was a fight that would become the largest cavalry action in the history of the Western Hemisphere. In this Harper's Weekly illustration, you see the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry charging against some dismounted Confederate horsemen manning cannon at the edge of the woodline in the distance. We're standing in the field over which that cavalry regiment charged, and behind me, still clearly visible, is the woodline. Brandy Station was an enormous fight and a confusing fight, a fight that extended over some 5 or 6 miles in territory, or 14,000 acres. Hour after hour the fighting went on, sabers flashing, guns firing, horses neighing. Dust soon settled over the area and became so thick in places that oftentimes friend could not distinguish an opponent as to whether he was a friend or an enemy. How confusing was the fight? At one point, the 35th Virginia Cavalry Battalion charged a Union battery. In all of the excitement and the melee of the situation, the 35th rode right through the battery and continued going. And it remained for the 12th Virginia Cavalry to come up and seize the battery in time. Late in the day, the action finally broke off, and Union horsemen drifted back across the river. One Union cavalryman commented that at Brandy Station there was far more fighting than generalship. The losses would explain part of that. We're standing in the yard of Auburn Plantation at Brandy Station. Behind me in the open fields on June 8th, Jeff Stewart had staged a grand review of his cavalry. In that same field the next day, a great battle had been fought, and the field was chewed up, dead horses, dead and wounded men everywhere. The Battle of Brandy Station remains somewhat controversial over the question, who won it? By the end of the day, by the narrowest of margins, Stewart still controlled the country. The battlefield was his, and he could claim a victory. And yet the casualties had been enormous. 500 Confederates, 900 Union soldiers, and we should add a third casualty figure at Brandy Station as well. Probably as many as 1,800 horses slain during the combat. After the Battle, a Massachusetts major would comment that at Brandy Station, the Confederate cavalry lost all prestige and never recovered it. That's an exaggeration, to be sure, but this marked the first time in the war that a Union soldier could make that statement, and he made it at Brandy Station.
No single individual more personified the divided loyalties of Virginia's Northern Piedmont than John Minor Botts. The tough and terrifying Botts, as he was once called, had been a distinguished Whig legislator and congressman. In 1861, he was so devoted to the Union that he publicly proclaimed secession to be the most atrocious and stupendous crime that has been committed since the crucifixion of the Lord. This got Botts thrown in jail for a short term. Upon his release, he retired to his Culpepper County estate and spent the remainder of the war openly defying all Confederate authority. The Botts plantation, Auburn, was the most impressive dwelling in the county. Botts lived there with his 3 daughters. Union soldiers respected the estate, whereas the country around it came to look little better than a wasteland. Confederate soldiers delighted in arousing the old man's anger by stealing his corn or using his fence rails for firewood. The embittered Botts died in 1869. He clearly opposed secession, detested the war, and courted Union favor, yet Botts seems not to have been against the Confederacy as much as he was its political leaders. They had bullied the Southern states into disunion, he thought, then shirked their responsibilities. Botts was among the first disgruntled Southerners to characterize the Civil War as a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight.
After the opening battle of the war, 35 miles away at Manassas, James and Fanny Broadus converted their new home at Brandy Station into a soldier hospital. One of the wounded Confederates urged the Broaduses to name the home Beauregard in honor of the Southern general who had been victorious at Manassas. This was done promptly. General Robert E. Lee is reported to have watched much of the cavalry battle of Brandy Station from the cupola of the Barber Mansion. The house stands now as a fitting backdrop for a report on the preservation of the Brandy Station battlefield. The site of that spectacular cavalry engagement came as close to being lost to 20th century development as any Civil War battleground of significance. That it does survive is due to the hard work and unbending dedication of a small group of historically minded citizens in Culpeper County. One of the leaders of that group is Willie Martin.
Brandy Station started out, we had a core group. We were able to get good legal advice, and we stuck with it. You've got to work with this thing every day, and it's not something that's accomplished in a month or two. We started in 88, and here it is, 98, 99, and we're still fighting for it. In Culpeper County now, we're seeing an influx of people from the Northern Virginia moving this way, buying up land, subdivisions and this type of thing. And in order for us to preserve, we've got to get people to give us easements on some land or be able to purchase land. And land in this part of the country now is going pretty steep. We probably got more publicity on Brandy Station than any preservation of a battlefield in the country. It takes a lot of effort, and without people willing to sacrifice and work at it, we were very fortunate. We had legal service given to us by Arnold and Porter law firm in Washington. One of their partners, Mr. Resnick, worked with us almost daily. We had Tersh Boasberg, who is probably the leading preservation attorney in the country, took our case at the beginning and worked through. Without Tersh, we probably never would have made it. But it took the local people. I've been on the board for years, but only been president for a couple of years. B. Mitchell and his wife and some of the other local people really pushed this thing, sacrificed a lot. We had a lot of opposition from the county, local people, just, why you want to save this? It's been there all these years and you've never done anything. But we could see that if we didn't do something, we were going to lose it all. So we feel now we got an opportunity to save and work on it.
It is often said that because Southern boys were so accustomed to the out-of-doors and horseback riding that they made far better cavalrymen than their Union counterparts. The record of operations until 1863 would seem to point this out. Nevertheless, beginning in 1863, first at Brandy Station, Union horsemen demonstrated that they could hold their own, properly led and properly organized. When Lee's army headed northward through Virginia in mid-June 1863 for a rendezvous with destiny at Gettysburg, a series of cavalry actions occurred in the southern part of Loudoun and the northern part of Fauquier counties. Three particular actions merit attention: Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville. The noise you hear behind me is the modern-day traffic on US 50. But close to that, standing silent, is a wartime bridge where one of those actions occurred. And to tell us about the cavalry engagements of that time is Robert O'Neill, one of the great authorities on the cavalry operations.
Built in the early 1800s, the bridge behind me was the scene of a furious artillery duel in the early afternoon of June 21st, 1863, as one of a series of actions that occurred during the Battle of Upperville, the third battle in a series of running engagements along Route 50 in the Snickersville Turnpike. There had been a battle on June 17th at Aldie, east of here. There had been another battle on the 19th of June at Middleburg, a couple miles to our east. And then on the morning of June 21st, Alfred Pleasanton launched his third attack as he tried to make for Ashby's Gap several miles west of here. In a series of small engagements, he crossed three streams, this being the third, where he met Stuart about noon on the afternoon of the 21st. And then Stuart retired as Federal infantry supporting Pleasanton's cavalry pushed him beyond this position here to an area just to our west on the outskirts of the town of Upperville, where the largest of these three engagements would take place, with about 10,000 troopers in mounted combat within a mile of the center of the town before Stuart was forced back by the advancing Federal cavalry. He fell back into Ashby's Gap at the base of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where he was supported by Longstreet's infantry. But what he had done was to prevent Alfred Pleasanton from accomplishing his mission, which was to find Lee's army. In that regard, Stuart had shown that he was still the superior commander.
Communication at the start of the Civil War consisted almost solely of the written word. No television, telephone, radio, computer, or fax machine connected one party with another. Private correspondence was the order of the day. In urban communities, there was the added benefit of newspapers. The Civil War became the first American newspaper war. A rather curious group of about 150 semi-professional adventurers, calling themselves field correspondents, joined the armies in file dispatches from the front to eager and gullible readers back on the home front. Some of these reporters, James Redpath, George Alfred Townsend, William Phillips, and Henry Villard, quickly come to mind, were conscientious in their work. Far too many correspondents, on the other hand, became pawns at the hands of generals, politicians, and editors. They wrote whatever was advantageous for them to write at a given moment. As a group, they were resourceful and courageous. As a group, too, they spied, lied, contrived, and manufactured. The thousands of stories they filed were full of patriotism, pathos, abuse, self-glorification, and party propaganda. Just as Northern readers did not know that the 1862 Battle of Fredericksburg was a Union defeat until weeks after the fact, Southern readers were likewise shocked to learn months later that the 1863 so-called big victory at Gettysburg had been no victory at all. In short, newspaper correspondents of the Civil War too often seemed more comfortable with fiction than with fact. They carried freedom of the press to an extreme that would not be equaled until late in this century. The war also touched the field of art. Many visual impressions of the contest came from special artists, as they were called, or non-combatant artist reporters, as they actually were. These men worked for newspapers and attached themselves to the field armies. The most distinguished of this group were Winslow Homer, Frank Visitelli, and Edwin Forbes. The principal sketch artist for the powerful Harper's Weekly newspaper was Alfred Ward. He was especially good at military sketches with political and/or sarcastic overtones. In the mid-19th century, Americans were fascinated with a new art form called photography. The coming of Civil War provided a coincidental opportunity for picture taking. Dozens of photographers followed the example of well-known New York portrait maker Matthew Brady, who said, "A spirit in my feet said go, and I went." The public clamored for war views, whether they were cartes de visite for albums, stereo views for stereoscopic viewers, or camp scenes and group photographs for posterity. Matthew Brady and his assistants, Alexander Gardner and James Gibson, were the first to reach the battlefield. Brady took a number of photographs of dead soldiers at Antietam. For the first time in American history, the general public could witness the suffering, the devastation, the horrible presence of death on a battlefield. And suddenly the Civil War came into the living rooms of American homes. In October 1862, only a month after the Battle of Antietam, Brady's first wet plate images went on exhibit in New York City. A newspaperman viewed the photographs and commented, "Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war. If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along streets, he has done something like it." But there is one side of the picture that the sun did not catch. It is the background of widows and orphans. Homes have been made desolate, and the light of life in thousands of hearts have been quenched forever. All of this desolation, imagination must paint. Broken hearts cannot be photographed. Like Orange, Culpepper, and Warrenton to the north, as well as Lynchburg and Danville to the south, Charlottesville was a railroad stop, supply depot, and hospital center. The remains of some 1,200 Confederate soldiers who died of wounds and disease are in the town cemetery. Two enduring monuments to Lee and Jackson are in downtown Charlottesville. The oldest, a likeness of Jackson, is unique. It depicts the bareheaded general galloping forward into action. The Lee statue shows the Southern chieftain mounted. Sculptor H.M. Schrady died while working on the Lee image. The well-known Leo Lintelli completed the figure in the mid-1920s. Down the tracks from Culpepper was the town of Orange, another county seat. It had been incorporated in 1834 and was just experiencing healthy growth when Civil War put a paralyzing stamp on the town. Menfolk marched away to war. The women waited and hoped, and while they did, homes became hospitals. 7 skirmishes took place in and around the small town. Armies occupied Orange time and again.
We are inside of St. Thomas Episcopal Church, Orange, Virginia. During the winter of 1863-64, the Army of Northern Virginia was occupying a defensive position known generally as the Rapidan Line, along the Rapidan River, just north of this town. Orange itself was the headquarters town for the Army of Northern Virginia, and General Lee's headquarters tent was actually about 1.5 miles east of Orange on the turnpike. General Lee attended this particular church regularly. I am standing at the location of the pew occupied by General Lee. The actual pew which he occupied was removed at the time that all of the pews in this church were replaced, and that particular pew has been preserved in another area of the church. Of particular interest is the service that was conducted on November the 22nd, 1863. And not only was General Lee in attendance, but also Confederate President Jefferson Davis. So not only was there a normal crowd here for General Lee, there was a huge crowd for these two dignitaries, General A.P. Hill and numerous other officers, high-level, high-ranking officers in the Confederate military were here for that service. In fact, if there was a standing room only crowd.
In the 1860s, you could not mention the Civil War without mentioning religion, nor could you mention religion without mentioning the Civil War. The two were so intertwined that they become one. Indeed, morale will rest primarily on religion throughout this conflict, and this applies to both sides. The churches, especially the churches in Virginia, suffered tremendous damage through occupation, through being caught in the whirlwind of war. But many of them were able to stay open, and they were houses of comfort to officers, to men, to the local parishioners and congregations as well. Here at St. Thomas's Church in Orange is a typical example of a church that was caught in the middle of war. And it is interesting to note that 4 days after President Davis, General Lee attended that November 22nd, 1863 service, Mr. Lincoln issued a proclamation calling on the nation to observe a day of Thanksgiving as a national holiday. Once again, religion and war, the two were one in that all-American contest. There are some similarities in comparing the battles of Chantilly and Brandy Station. They both were without clear victors. At Chantilly, Stonewall Jackson failed to turn the flank of the Union Army, and John Pope failed to drive Jackson from the field. At Brandy Station, which many consider a draw, Stuart still controlled the countryside, but the Union troopers had inflicted great damage to the Southern horsemen in casualties and prestige. Both battles had losses of about 1,500 soldiers. Both deserve remembrance and preservation. The biggest contrast between these two engagements is what happened to the fields where they occurred. Thousands of acres at Brandy Station, known as the largest cavalry battle in the Western Hemisphere, have been saved. Chantilly, on the other hand, has nothing in remembrance and little in preservation. Chantilly became the victim of an erosion by urban sprawl until what remains today is an embarrassment to those who see the value of history. If the American soldiers of North and South could come and see what has been forgotten, how would they feel? What would they say? One of William Shakespeare's lines in Julius Caesar is, "Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war." Stephen Crane voiced the same sentiment in his novel, The Red Badge of Courage. They were going to look at war, the red animal, war, the blood-swollen god. Virginians in 1865 could empathize with those thoughts. The proud Old Dominion had taken a physical and mental beating never known before or since in the Western Hemisphere. A Pennsylvania surgeon stationed in the Northern Piedmont at the halfway point of the war observed, "If the former inhabitants are ever permitted to return here, they will be unable to find a single familiar landmark. You cannot conceive how a country is devastated by an invading army. An occasional house tumbling in ruins meets the eye, but presents no indication of a once happy home. I saw the other day a solitary peach tree in blossom. It was a single flame of hope in a wilderness." In all that terrible conflict of blood and treasure and intangibles, Americans had tested whether they had the courage of their convictions about democracy. This bloody test took 700,000 lives. The Civil War reduced the South from the richest to the poorest part of the Union. While Northerners later came to view the struggle as a terrible episode in history, but without much sense of presence, Southerners took consolation from wasted gallantry in the coveted myth of a lost cause. Virginia had to weather the worst storms of that Civil War. Caught between strong allegiance to the Union and strong association with its Southern sisters, the Old Dominion felt the agonies of divided loyalties worse than any other state. Here it became truly a contest between father and son, a fight between brothers. In war, there is no second prize for the losers. However, today the Northern Piedmont's rolling country pulses with activity. The woods and undulating fields silently hold the memories of another nation-building time. Virginia is a blend of the old and the new, such as few states can claim. We act with determination and move forward with confidence because the past is such a good teacher. We remember because we must not forget.